So how did a building with such massive steel framework disintegrate into such a tiny pile of rubble from a few tiny fires? A government agency, FEMA, conducted an investigation into why the buildings in the World Trade Center collapsed. However, the editor of Fire Engineering magazine became so disgusted by the investigation that the January 2002 issue carried an angry article in which he accused the investigation of being a half-baked farce. Later that month, both Bush and Cheney asked Tom Daschle to limit the investigation. Apparently, a half-baked farce was more of an investigation than Bush and Cheney wanted. I suppose they would have preferred a quarter-baked farce. In March 2002, the Committee on Science of the House of Representatives held a meeting to investigate the investigation. There were more insults and accusations at this meeting. For example, Congressman Boehlert complained that the investigation seems shrouded in excessive secrecy. Professor Corbett complained that they were trying to run an investigation with part-time engineers and scientists and on a shoestring budget. There were also accusations that landlords and insurance companies interfered with the investigation. It seems that a lot of people were helping President Bush ruin the investigation. During April 2002, the final bits of rubble from the World Trade Center were removed. The thick pieces of steel were sold to foreign nations as scrap metal and at a very low price, while the less valuable pieces were shipped by barge to be buried. By May 2002, the World Trade Center had been cleaned up and all the rubble destroyed, so nobody could conduct any further investigations into how the buildings collapsed. The editor of Fire Engineering wrote months earlier that this destruction of rubble is illegal. He pointed out that our laws demand rubble be saved from major disasters so that we can learn what happened and improve our buildings and fire prevention techniques. Our government violated the law when it destroyed the rubble from the World Trade Center. Here are some of the government officials who tried to impeach President Clinton. Tens of millions of Americans were outraged when Clinton lied to us about what he and Monica were doing. These Americans proudly boasted that they are law-abiding citizens, and they will not tolerate government officials who cheat, lie, or deceive. Yet millions of these same Americans either helped our government violate laws during the investigation of the World Trade Center collapse, or those who are not actively helping with the illegal activities were ignoring them. Ken Starr spent $40 million investigating the sexual activities of President Clinton. Why didn't Ken Starr advocate giving money to the investigators of the World Trade Center collapse so that they didn't have to depend on part-time scientists and on a shoestring budget? Are the sexual activities of Bill Clinton truly more important to us than an attack on our nation? In May 2002, FEMA released the report on the collapse of the buildings. Not surprisingly, the report doesn't explain anything. For example, rather than explain how the fires caused Building 7 to collapse, the FEMA report has this: the specifics of the fires in Building 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Our government spent 7 months investigating the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings, and at the end, they announced they have no idea what happened to Building 7. If FEMA was a private company, I would demand my money back. Since they are a government agency, their worthless report is evidence that they are involved in covering up a scam. FEMA claims that they cannot understand how Building 7 collapsed. But perhaps you and I can figure it out by watching the videos of it collapsing. Incidentally, this video is lousy because it comes from people who recorded the TV news. As with the security video that shows Flight 77 crashing into the Pentagon, nobody wants to provide good quality video of Building 7 as it collapses. At the top of Building 7 is a rectangular penthouse that contains air conditioning and other equipment. If you recall, the fires were on the lower floors, not near the roof. However, the penthouse is the first part of the building to collapse. How could the fires cause damage to the penthouse without damaging all the floors in between? Here's a different view of the collapse. And another view. When fires cause steel buildings to crumble, do they normally produce this much dust? Well, since fire has never caused a steel building to crumble before, I guess we'll never know if this dust is typical. The person who took this next video decided to point his camera at Building 7 at just the right moment. Is this a coincidence? Who is this person? Now that you've seen how the building collapsed, do you think these tiny fires were responsible? If so, how did the fire destroy the entire steel structure? Building 7 collapsed in the same manner that demolition companies destroy old buildings. They use explosives to shatter the joints holding the steel beams together. The explosives are detonated in a sequence that causes the building to fall vertically downward into a tiny pile of rubble. Also, when the building is tall, the explosives are often timed to destroy the interior of the building before the exterior walls are broken, thereby causing the interior section to fall first. As the interior pieces fall, they pull the exterior walls towards the interior. This creates a small pile of rubble with the exterior walls laying on top of the rubble. Photos of the rubble from Building 7 show exactly that, namely the exterior walls on top of the interior pieces. Normally, if a 47-story steel building crumbled into a pile of rubble because of a couple of tiny fires, people around the world would be shocked and want to know what happened. Architects would be interested in understanding what happened so that they could design buildings better. People who live or work in tall buildings would wonder, can fire do this to my building? However, are any architects asking why Building 7 fell down? Are any people in tall buildings wondering if their building might also fall down? Why does nobody care that a steel building disintegrated for no apparent reason? Part of the problem is that most people simply don't know much about Building 7 due to the incredible secrecy surrounding this building. We were frequently told of the evilness of Osama and Saddam, but how often did you see the collapse of Building 7? How many articles did you find in newspapers or magazines about Building 7? The only explanation for this secrecy that I can think of is that nobody can explain how Osama caused Building 7 to collapse. By keeping this issue a secret, they are hoping that people will forget about the incident rather than ask, "What happened to Building 7?" One possible reason for the secrecy about Building 7 is that it may have been the control center for demolishing the World Trade Center. The 23rd floor of this building was given $15 million worth of renovations to make it into an emergency command center for Mayor Giuliani. For example, it was given bullet and bomb-resistant windows. There is nothing strange about adding reinforcements to a government office to protect them in case of attack. In fact, many retail businesses have bullet-resistant windows. However, this particular office had its own air and water supply, and it was designed to withstand winds of 160 miles per hour. To make the situation more suspicious, the reinforcements were only for this one floor, so that meant most of the building was just an ordinary office building. Why would they protect only one floor? This seems as silly as installing bulletproof glass in only one window of the president's automobile. Furthermore, why would they need their own air supply? And how about the protection from a 160-mile-per-hour wind? Well, consider that when the towers fell down, clouds of dust and grit were thrown outward at a very high speed. The only people protected from that blast were in this special emergency command center. Of course, the city government claims the entire building was evacuated at 9 in the morning, so nobody was inside this special reinforced bunker when the towers collapsed. This meant that the city spent $15 million to make this special reinforced bunker, and then everybody abandoned it just when it would have been useful. But did everybody really abandon Building 7? It would have been a great place for people to supervise the attack because the 23rd floor provided a wonderful view of the area, and the occupants were protected from the dust and debris. To make the situation even more suspicious, as I explain in more detail in the book, the flight paths of the two airplanes that hit the towers appear to have been on a course towards Building 7, as if this building was broadcasting a homing signal. The towers did not simply fall down or break into pieces. Rather, as jets of dust flew out the windows at extreme velocity, that portion of the building disintegrated. Dust was thrown hundreds of feet. When it was over, it was difficult to find anything resembling office furniture, chunks of concrete, human bodies, or large pieces of the steel frame. The towers had steel frames. They were not steel-reinforced concrete structures. The concrete was used only as a flooring material. Somehow, virtually all of the beams broke apart into short sections. Only a few steel beams that were along the outside of the tower remained connected together, such as these. Here are two steel columns that are still connected together by steel plates. These columns were along the outside of the tower. This assembly was also along the outside of the tower. It shows damage, but the steel parts held together. How could only a few assemblies along the outside be strong enough to survive the collapse? A closer view of the rubble makes it look as if the towers were put through a giant shredding machine. What happened to all of the office furniture? Where are the elevators? What about the staircases? The concrete, office furniture, and people disintegrated into such tiny pieces that the firemen were scooping them up with buckets. Only the thick pieces of steel survived the collapse. Nearby buildings look as if they were decorated with tinsel. The shiny objects are pieces of the aluminum coverings from the outer columns of the towers. The aluminum coverings were shredded into pieces and blown up to several hundred feet away. In this photo, the sunlight reflects from the pieces of aluminum, making them more visible. How can buildings made of massive steel beams and thick steel plates shred themselves into pieces? This is as ridiculous as an automobile crashing into a wall and then shredding itself into pieces. Buildings and cars are made of a low-carbon steel, and this type of steel simply does not behave in this manner. This type of steel bends. It does not shatter into pieces. There should be large, twisted pieces of steel assemblies in this rubble. Perhaps you wonder if the beams in the World Trade Center were thin and delicate, and that the fire destroyed the towers because the stupid architects did not make the beams strong enough. However, architects always give a building more strength than it needs in order to provide a margin of safety. The towers withstood storms for decades, and there was never any sign that reinforcements were needed. These two rectangular columns ran up the center of the towers. They are usually referred to as core columns because they were in the center of the towers. Each tower had 47 of these core columns. The thickness of the walls in these columns varied from 4 inches at the ground to about a 1/4 inch at the very top of the tower. The columns in this photo are about 2 inches thick, so they were somewhere near the middle of the tower. This photo shows both a rectangular core column and some square exterior columns. There were 236 of these square columns running up the exterior of each tower. Every floor was a mesh of steel trusses. There were 2 sets of trusses crisscrossing each other to form a rectangular grid. This diagram shows only one set of trusses. The missing set would be traveling left to right in this diagram. The purple lines along the right side show the orientation and location of the missing trusses. Corrugated steel pans were attached to the top of the trusses. Concrete was poured into these pans to form strong, flat, and fireproof floors. The exterior columns were spaced every meter along the outside of the towers. Windows were placed between the columns. The view in this diagram is looking towards the windows from the core columns. The exterior columns were further strengthened with steel plates. The plates were welded to the columns and then bolted to one another. The plates formed straps around the tower. Since the floors were spaced 12 feet apart, that means this grid of trusses was repeated every 12 feet. The steel straps that wrapped around the tower were also repeated every 12 feet. As you can imagine, that put a lot of steel in this building. The empty space in the trusses was used for ceiling tiles, electric lights, air conditioning ducts, and other utilities. It is important to realize that the framework of these towers were 100% steel. By comparison, the building in Oklahoma City that Tim McVeigh was accused of destroying had a concrete framework with steel reinforcing rods in the concrete. This is a highly simplified cross-section of the tower. It shows one floor of the tower, looking down onto the concrete floor. There were 47 rectangular columns in the center of the tower, although only 4 are shown in this simple diagram. There were 236 exterior columns, although only 16 are shown. These exterior columns were literally on the outside of the building. Many people assume that these towers disintegrated because they were weak, but there is no evidence for such an accusation. Rather, the photos and the descriptions from the people inside the towers prove that these towers were so incredibly strong that when the airplanes crashed into them, each tower merely swayed a bit in the opposite direction and then swayed back to their normal position. Both towers then remained motionless. People inside the towers felt them tilt, but the movement was so small that neither photos nor video show the tilting. Winter storms caused the towers to shake more than those airplane crashes. How could the towers absorb 80-ton airplanes crashing into them at 400 miles per hour without wobbling enough for us to observe it? Obviously, these towers were incredibly strong. According to the engineering sites that have technical data for these towers, the wind force that these towers had to withstand was greater than the force of those airplanes. In other words, a strong wind put more stress on the towers than those airplanes. So what caused these strong buildings to shatter into pieces? The official explanation is that a fire did it. Since no fire has ever destroyed a steel structure before, how could fire destroy buildings strong enough to handle the crash of an 80-ton airplane? The only difference between the fires in the towers and conventional office fires is that thousands of gallons of jet fuel had splattered inside the towers. Is jet fuel capable of creating some type of monster fire that destroys steel buildings? Let's take a look. This hole was created by Flight 11 when it crashed into the North Tower. This hole is black, not brightly colored with flames from a fire. If a fire destroyed these buildings, why are there so few flames? Why are these holes so black? As I describe more thoroughly in the book, the photos provide evidence that the fires were small. This photo is an example. Let's zoom in for a closer view. There is a woman standing in the hole created by the engine of the airplane, and she is alive. On the floor above her and to her left is a man, although he is more difficult to see. Let's zoom in on that woman. She appears to be wearing white pants and has long hair. There is no sign that her clothes or hair have been burned. It appears that there is another woman lying on the floor and looking over the edge, but the photo does not have enough detail to be certain. These women seem to be looking down at the ground. Some reports say that up to 200 people jumped out of the buildings. These women may be wondering if they were jumping into a giant net that the firemen had set up for them. On the floor above these women and to their left is a man standing in a broken window. The Boeing 767 that hit this tower was a large airplane with about 80 tons of metal, people, and luggage. The plane slammed into the tower at perhaps 400 miles per hour. Pieces of the aircraft, flooring, and office furnishings would have flown through 2 or 3 floors. Anybody in the path of this flying debris would have been killed. The thousands of gallons of jet fuel that sprayed into this area and then caught on fire would certainly kill a lot of people also. The only way anybody could survive this airplane crash was if the flying debris and the fires did not reach them. Since at least one man and woman survived, and since they were on different floors, they proved that the fires and airplane debris did not extend throughout the entire area of the crash zone. Furthermore, these people walked to the hole from wherever they were at the time of the crash. How could this woman walk through burning jet fuel? How could she survive fires that were so intense that they were capable of destroying a steel structure? To put that another way, how could a fire destroy a massive steel structure if it was not capable of destroying human life? Obviously, some areas were not soaked with jet fuel, and the fires were not everywhere. This would explain why the holes are so black and why there are so few flames. We can see this woman because she was brave enough to walk to the very edge of the hole, but there may be other people farther inside who are staying away from the hole. We can see this man because he is next to a broken window, but we cannot see into the windows because of the glare. So it's possible that there are other people near him, but behind the glass. What are the chances that only 2 people survived the airplane crash and fires, and both of them were coincidentally caught in this photo? I would bet that other people also survived, but we cannot see them. They may be trying to get down the stairs. As I explain in more detail in the book, there is no evidence that the fires in these towers were extreme. In fact, the fire in the Meridian Plaza office building in Philadelphia in 1991 was much worse, and that building did not even break into 2 pieces. The fire in the South Tower was so small that it did not even spread from one side of the floor to the other. The people who jumped out the windows created the illusion that the fire was so intense that they would rather jump than be burned by the fire. However, the photos do not show fire in the area where these people were jumping. Rather, the photos show lots of smoke. The smoke and the lack of flames are evidence that the fires were not getting enough oxygen. This would cause the plastic and rubber to create toxic smoke. This in turn could cause people to jump to avoid a slow, agonizing death from toxic smoke. Even if the fires were intense, fire does not shatter steel structures. Look at the steel grate in a fireplace. The grate is in contact with hot coals for hours. Sometimes natural gas flames burn underneath at the same time. However, the grates never shatter into pieces. Rather, the heat merely causes the iron to oxidize faster than normal. After many years, the grate develops a multicolored crust of oxide, with particles of ash and soot in the crevices. Pieces of the grate eventually fall off, but only because of the thinning of the metal due to oxidation. No fire has ever caused a fireplace grate, steel building, steel automobile, or any other steel structure to disintegrate. The maximum temperature hydrocarbons can reach in the atmosphere is about 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. However, that maximum temperature can be reached only when the hydrocarbons and the air are mixed in perfect proportions. These perfect proportions are reached only in a few controlled situations, such as a kitchen stove. This produces flames that are clean and a beautiful blue, rather than yellow and leaving trails of soot. Even though stoves reach the maximum possible temperature, they never shatter into pieces. So how could even lower temperatures cause the towers to disintegrate? Controlled Demolition is a company that demolishes old buildings. They demolished the building in Oklahoma City that Tim McVeigh was accused of blowing up. They were also hired to clean up the mess at the World Trade Center. They developed a special explosive and technique of using it for demolishing steel structures. They are so proud of this technology that they trademarked its abbreviation, DREXS. Their British division describes the technology as, "Our Drexus systems segment steel components into pieces matching the lifting capacity of the available equipment." In other words, if your trucks can hold pieces of steel up to 24 feet in length, then this company will cause all steel assemblies to break into sections 24 feet or less. Look at the rubble of the World Trade Center. Is it a coincidence that the entire steel framework of both towers broke into pieces no longer than the trucks that were hauling them away? Only a few of the thousands of pieces had to be cut with torches. If a fire can do exactly what controlled demolition does with their special trademarked explosives, then I'd like to start a new business called Fire Demolition Incorporated. This company will demolish buildings by setting a few small fires on a few floors. These fires will demolish the building just as thoroughly, but at a much lower cost. I need money to get this business established. Are any of you interested in investing? NASA and the U.S. Geological Survey created this thermal map of the temperature of the rubble. This map was created 5 days after the towers were attacked. Obviously, the rubble would be cooler after 5 days than it was on September 11th. Also, firemen sprayed water on the rubble during those 5 days. However, one location in the rubble of Building 7 was above the melting point of aluminum, and so was one location in the rubble of the South Tower. Not surprisingly, smoke came out of the rubble for months. Peter Tully, president of one company hired to remove debris, and Mark Lazo, president of Controlled Demolition, told the American Free Press that steel had melted at the bottom of the basements in the towers and Building 7. These incredible temperatures are more evidence that explosives were used. The explosives in the basements had to be powerful to break apart the massive steel beams. Explosives create very high temperatures, and the heat had nowhere to go since it was deep underground. According to the scientists who analyzed the seismic data, the North Tower collapsed in about 8 seconds. The collapse started at about the 94th floor, near this woman. This means that 94 floors shattered at an average rate of about 10 floors per second. If this woman had tossed a steel beam off the edge, it would have hit the ground about 8 seconds later. The formula to figure this out is very simple, if we ignore air resistance. 94 floors at 12 feet per floor is 1,128 feet. Divide that by 16 and take the square root, and we get 8.4 seconds. This means that the North Tower collapsed as fast as objects fall when there is no air resistance. As I explained in my book, explosives were shattering the towers slightly faster than the rubble was falling. The towers were built by the government, so taxpayers owned both of them. However, somehow the government was convinced to lease the towers for 99 years. Larry Silverstein became landlord on July 24th, less than 2 months before the attack. He then had control of the maintenance and security departments, and he began to replace security personnel. Silverstein brought Frank Lowy into the deal to become landlord of the underground shopping mall. Lowy is a billionaire who owns shopping malls in several nations. After the towers disintegrated, Silverstein demanded insurance companies pay him twice what the policy stated on the grounds that each tower was a separate attack. What a coincidence that after these guys got control of the World Trade Center, Osama decided to destroy the entire complex. Or is this Israeli journalist correct that a few Israelis were involved in the attack? He believes that the wedding hall that collapsed mysteriously in Jerusalem was their test of demolishing a building while people were in it. And is he correct that the mysterious crash of Egypt's Flight 990 was a test of getting control of an airplane? A newspaper in New Hampshire mentioned the amazing coincidence that the air traffic controller watching over Flight 990 also watched over the 2 planes that hit the towers. How could explosives be put inside the towers while people were working there? The packages of explosives could be placed in the area above the ceiling tiles. Each package would have a battery and a radio receiver. A computer would be able to detonate the explosives in any sequence by sending the appropriate signals to the packages. A researcher of the Kennedy assassination points out that most people believe in coincidence theories because they explain everything as being due to coincidence. For example, most people believe it was coincidence that this photographer decided to film the 80th floor of the South Tower and then moved the camera to where the fireball erupted. That Todd Beamer decided to spend his last 13 minutes of life talking on a lousy quality airplane phone to a stranger rather than his pregnant wife. That fire pulverized 3 steel buildings even though fire never did such a thing before or after. That terrorists hit the empty section of the Pentagon. How do coincidence theories make more sense than conspiracy theories? Some people consider my book to adequately explain that the September 11th attack was a scam. However, some people who know me personally responded by giving me clippings of newspaper and magazine articles to show me that Flight 77 really did hit the Pentagon, and that Osama did not have any assistance from the U.S. government. I have also been told that the Discovery Channel thoroughly explains that fire caused the towers to collapse. Most people are certain that the true source of knowledge comes from large corporations, not individuals such as myself. Therefore, I would like to show evidence that some news reports are attempts to manipulate us, not educate us. For example, James Robbins claims to have seen Flight 77 crash into the Pentagon. When Robbins heard of Mason's accusation that Flight 77 never hit the Pentagon, Robbins wrote an insulting article for the National Review in which he claims Lenin, Hitler, and Pol Pot were just like Mason. However, those of us who question our government are not like Hitler, nor are we unpatriotic. Rather, we simply want the government to provide evidence for their theories. People who doubt that Flight 77 hit the Pentagon are equivalent to people in 1933 who questioned Hitler's explanation of the fire in the Reichstag, the German government building. Hitler claimed the fire was set by communists, and he used the fire to justify giving himself more control over Germany. Robbins tries to create an unpleasant image for those of us who question the U.S. government. Robbins is behaving like the propaganda writers of Hitler, Lenin, and Pol Pot. He is trying to manipulate emotions, not provide us with intelligent information about the September 11th attack. In fact, Robbins admits in his article that he never read Mason's book. Why would the National Review publish an article in which the author insults a book he never read? Are the editors really trying to inform their readers of world events? Or are they merely promoting the official government policies? Robbins is described as a national security analyst. He is also a professor of international relations at the National Defense University, which has this building in Washington, D.C. However, the staff, courses, and photos of this university make it appear to be a military agency, not a real university. In this photo, for example, a vice admiral is taking command as president of the university. President Bush must think highly of this university because he spoke there a few months before the September 11th attack. However, since James Robbins writes reviews of books he never read for the National Review, we ought to wonder if he is also providing his students with equally worthless material. We should also wonder if the National Review is a publication of the CIA. This would explain why the cover of one issue called George Bush a Conqueror, while another insulted Canadians as wimps. Although you may ignore the National Review, these types of publications do have influence over the public. These journalists alter public opinion, and that in turn affects your life and your nation. An example of their effect can be seen with a guy named Mike Collins. You probably know of Collins because he had his 15 minutes of fame in November 2000 with this cartoon about the Florida presidential ballot. Collins learned of Mason's internet site in August 2002. Collins looked at the photos of the rubble at the Pentagon and found himself unable to find any evidence of Flight 77. He became concerned that Mason might be correct, that the attack was a scam. His concern was brief, however, because he soon found a rebuttal to Mason at the Urban Legends website. This article shows that Mason is a fool. Collins was so impressed by this article that he considered it to fully answer Mason's questions. For example, Mason asked, "Why are there no pieces of Flight 77 in the photographs?" According to the Urban Legends article, the answer is, any pieces of wreckage large enough to be identifiable burned up in the intense fire. However, aluminum and steel do not burn easily. You can prove this to yourself with a gas stove. The flames in a stove are at the maximum temperature possible for hydrocarbons burning in the atmosphere. Therefore, if you cannot catch aluminum on fire in the flames of a stove, then aluminum ain't likely to catch on fire in the flames of an airplane crash. It's possible that the Urban Legend site was created to deceive us. After building up a reputation of honesty by dispelling some simple rumors, the CIA, or whoever, could slip in deceptive articles. This would explain why they would post that stupid article about Flight 77 burning up. Although Collins was impressed by the article at the Urban Legend site, the article by James Robbins seems to have had more of an effect on his emotions. Collins has a site on the internet where he posts his comments on life. His commentary for August 22, 2002 began with the angry sentence,
"I'd like to punch Terry Mason in the face, repeatedly."
He ended that day's entry by repeating the paragraph from Robbins which contained the insulting comparison of Mason to Hitler and Lenin. Do you consider Mike Collins to be of no importance? Do you think I'm getting carried away with an insignificant topic? Collins is just one example of people who are influenced by deceptive articles. If you do nothing about the manipulation of the public, you are allowing the manipulation to continue. If, instead, you brought this issue to people's attention, more people might demand higher standards from authors, government officials, and political candidates. At the moment, nobody is under pressure to write intelligent articles. For example, Gary Bauer, one of the Republican candidates for president in 2000, tells us that Mason's book is obscene and disgusting. He goes on to refer to Mason as a lunatic, and he refers to his research as an hallucination. If Bauer offered evidence that Mason suffers from hallucinations, and if he supported his accusation that Mason's book is obscene, then his report would be worth reading. However, his article is nothing but insults. When children behave this way, we tell them to stop it. The world might improve if we discuss issues, but it won't if all we do is insult one another. Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney of Georgia wanted an investigation of the attack, and as a result, she received the same abuse as Mason. For example, Jonah Goldberg, an editor at the National Review, informs his readers that McKinney is dumber than rock salt and more repugnant than Yasser Arafat's 3-week-old underwear. In Florida, Kathleen Parker of the Orlando Sentinel writes that McKinney is possibly a delusional paranoiac. She also suspects that we tolerate McKinney because she's black, and we're afraid to criticize her because we might be perceived as racist. This is an amusing accusation when it comes from a woman. The reason is that we could use this same argument on her. In other words, we could say that the editors of the Orlando Sentinel are tolerating Kathleen Parker because she's a woman, and they're worried about being perceived as sexist. Wouldn't it be better if our media impressed us with intelligent articles rather than provide insults? The Orlando Sentinel published an article by David Porter in which he explained the two reasons he does not believe conspiracy theories. First, we conspiracy people would be killed if we were correct. Second, some government officials would do something to stop the scams. Porter brings up very important issues. Regarding his first point, millions of people will dismiss what I say on the grounds that if I was correct, the people who conducted the scam wouldn't allow me to expose it to the world. Since nobody cares what I say, I must be spewing nonsense.
In my book, I explained that the towers were blown up with explosives, and Building 7 was the command center. These are serious accusations. If I am even partially correct, why would they let me sell this book and talk to you about it? Wouldn't the people who conducted this scam want to kill me?
Most people find it difficult to believe that somebody could expose a scam without the people involved trying to shut him up. Until recently, I had this same attitude. Understanding why they ignore us will help you understand how they get away with these scams. I'll explain this concept by showing you why they ignore the conspiracy people regarding Tim McVeigh and the bomb that exploded in Oklahoma City in 1995. General Ben Parton is retired now, but he was one of the military's experts on explosives. Based on his experience, he did not believe that a mixture of fertilizer and fuel oil exploding in the street could have been responsible for the pulverized concrete at the Murrah building. He felt that the distance between the truck and the building was too great. Also, the non-symmetrical damage to the building was suspicious. He decided to go to Oklahoma City and investigate for himself. Explosives create incredible pressures that can pulverize concrete and rip apart steel beams. However, the farther away a building is from an explosive, the less intense the pressure will be. Furthermore, McVeigh's bomb was a mixture of fuel oil and fertilizer, and that type of bomb does not create pressures as high as RDX. This means that McVeigh's bomb had to be even closer to the concrete than a bomb of RDX. Was McVeigh's bomb close enough to the building? General Parton calculated the pressure from McVeigh's bomb at various distances. He created this chart to show the pressures. McVeigh's truck bomb is at the bottom of this chart. The columns that supported this building are shown as solid rectangles. The red rectangles are the columns that collapsed. The collapsed columns are in the area shaded with red. The columns in this building were made of concrete with steel reinforcing rods. They did not merely fall over, rather the concrete was pulverized, exposing bare reinforcing rods. Parton's calculations show that when the blast reached the outside of the building, it was a couple thousand pounds per square inch. This would have done a lot of damage to the outside of the building and the office furniture. But his calculations show that when the blast reached the columns, the pressure was too low to pulverize the concrete. One of the columns that was pulverized was so far from the bomb that the pressure would have been only 27 pounds per square inch. Parton also points out that the damage to the building was not symmetrical. The red shading shows the non-symmetrical area. The blast of hot gas was in the shape of a sphere, so that non-symmetrical area should not have occurred. The photograph on the left side is looking up at this non-symmetrical area. There is no way to explain how the truck bomb could have carved out this indentation. The only sensible explanation is that explosives had been placed on the column that supported this section of the building, and when those explosives were detonated, the column was shattered and this section collapsed. Parton's conclusion is that demolition explosives were placed in the building, and McVeigh's truck bomb was merely to fool people into believing that McVeigh was responsible. Unless somebody can show that General Parton's calculations are wrong, the Oklahoma City bombing was a scam. Unfortunately, many people dismiss Parton on the grounds that if he was correct, the government wouldn't allow him to expose the scam. Now consider that unless somebody can show that Masson, I, and others are wrong, the September 11th attack was a sequel to the Oklahoma City bombing. The attacks were identical. For example, in Oklahoma, Tim McVeigh was the foolish patsy, a truck bomb grabbed the attention of the public, and demolition explosives that had been placed in the building before the attack were detonated while people were inside. On September 11th, Mohammed Atta was the foolish patsy, airplane crashes grabbed the attention of the public, and demolition explosives that had been placed in the buildings before the attack were detonated while people were inside. Furthermore, some of the same people and companies were used for the investigation and cleanup of both attacks, such as Gene Corley and Controlled Demolitions Incorporated. Whoever did the Oklahoma City bombing scam got away with it. This undoubtedly gave them confidence to expand to something bigger. And since they got away with the September 11th attack, they may be planning something even more spectacular. How did they get away with the Oklahoma City bombing scam? Partly by ignoring Parton. If Parton were to die in a mysterious manner, many people would suspect that he was killed because he was correct. Therefore, the best policy for the people who conducted the Oklahoma bombing scam is to ignore Parton, which creates the impression that he is a conspiracy nut. And then they use the media to fool people into believing McVeigh destroyed the Murrah building with fertilizer and fuel oil. For example, the June 3, 2002 issue of PC Magazine, which is supposed to be about computers, carried an article by John Dvorak called Crackpots, Cranks, and Conspiracies. Dvorak ridiculed people as crackpots for believing conspiracy theories. One of his remarks about the Oklahoma City bombing: according to the websites, there were 2 explosions. No, Dvorak, according to the witnesses, there were 2 explosions. The websites merely repeat reports from local news reporters. After I published my book, I was told of a video made by Alex Jones called 911, The Road to Tyranny. This video has lots of local news reports about the Oklahoma City bombing. Some reports mention that an unexploded bomb was found inside the Murrah building, and later a second unexploded bomb was found. I suppose that if all explosives had detonated, the damage to the building would have been symmetrical. Here are a few brief samples of news reports from his video.
The Justice Department is reporting that a second explosive device has been found.
A second bomb has been found inside that federal building.
There are also reports that Tim McVeigh was not alone in that truck.
That they reveal more than one bomber.
Other reports explain that it was not McVeigh who set off the truck bomb.
That it may have been John Doe number 2, not Timothy McVeigh.
Security cameras on nearby buildings prove that McVeigh drove the truck and then walked away, while someone else in the truck did the work. The FBI even admits the security video exists.
The FBI also confirmed those tapes exist.
As you might expect, the FBI will not let us see those security videos. Could it be the same reason the military refuses to let us see the security video at the Pentagon? Why did these news reporters provide evidence that the Oklahoma City bombing was a scam? Are they crackpots? Conspiracy nuts? No, the bombing was simply a sloppy scam. Witnesses heard 2 or 3 explosions, security cameras saw that Tim McVeigh was a patsy, and some explosives failed to detonate. It was a messy scam, and the people involved had a lot of work to do to cover up the mess. During that time, some of the local reporters were giving honest news reports. However, the national news reporters provided us with the official government lies. The professionals who make millions of dollars per year never let the truth slip out. Pat Shannon provides more evidence that the bombing was a scam. His video has lots of interviews, such as witnesses of the bombing and General Parton. This brings me to the reason I brought up the Oklahoma City bombing. Since 1995, lots of people have been providing evidence that the Oklahoma City bombing is a scam. However, David Porter and millions of other people dismiss these conspiracy theories on the grounds that nobody would be allowed to expose a scam. The truth can be put in front of people's faces, but most people will dismiss it as a conspiracy theory if only a minority of people believe it. People, and most animals, follow each other rather than wander through life alone. This is most obvious with our hair and clothing styles. People are just sheep with intelligence. We also have a craving for praise, which is why award ceremonies are so popular. By comparison, we become defensive when criticized. The people who conduct these scams take advantage of these aspects of human behavior. They have taken the role of a Pied Piper. They fill their news reports with praise and entertainment. They titillate the flock of sheeple by telling them that Americans are the greatest people in the world, that Americans have a free press and are the most educated people, that Americans are heroes who fight the forces of evil. By comparison, people such as myself cause angry reactions when we tell the people that they are ignorant and conceited fools who are letting themselves and their nation be raped repeatedly. The Pied Pipers lead the flock of sheeple away from General Parton's report, Mason's books, my book, and everybody else who has evidence of these scams. Therefore, most people will never know what we say. So what difference does it make if we expose the scams? This concept especially applies to me. I don't have secret sources of information. I simply looked at the news reports and photographs and figured it out. Why would they worry about those of us who figure out the attacks are scams? There are thousands of us. It makes more sense for them to concentrate on controlling the media. Besides, we are of different races, religions, and nationalities, and we are scattered around the world. How could they silence so many of us without attracting attention? You might think that they could use a secret method to kill us, such as exposing us to cancer chemicals or arranging accidents. However, this would be a lot of work on their part, and it would attract attention if everybody who believed these attacks were scams were dying from cancer or accidents. David Porter might read my book if I died mysteriously, but the only two groups of people they truly need to fight are the people who fight them, the people who leak secrets. For example, Senator Paul Wellstone was actively resisting the war in Iraq. Not surprisingly, his airplane had an unfortunate accident. Read the article on Flight 77 at the Urban Legend site, or read articles by these other suspicious journalists. Why would the people behind these scams worry about me when they can manipulate millions of people with these simplistic articles? The best policy for the people who conduct these scams is to convince the nation that Mason, I, and others are anti-American, delusional paranoiacs who are more repugnant than Yasser Arafat's 3-week-old underwear. With journalists like these dominating our media, and with most people trusting them, what difference does it make if I expose the September 11th scam? David Porter's second argument is that many government officials would do something if the attack was a scam. He assumes that these officials would put on their shining armor, jump on their horses, and rush off to fight the people who did this. But how can our government fight a scam unless it investigates the attack and determines that it was indeed a scam? The first action our government should have taken was to investigate the attack. Congresswoman McKinney was one of the government officials looking into it, and lots of citizens of different races, religions, and organizations were also investigating. The American Free Press, for example, was running one article after the next about the suspicious aspects of the attack, and several radio talk shows were also investigating. But David Porter and most other citizens ignored or insulted these people, while giving full support to Bush and Cheney, who wanted to limit the investigation.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th.
Not surprisingly, our government never found any evidence that the attack was a scam. Our government never even found a reason for why Building 7 collapsed. Porter is correct that there are some people in our government who would not tolerate a scam. Parton and McKinney are examples. However, most Americans ignored or ridiculed both of them, while supporting these two rich kids as they pretended to be world leaders. and these guys as they used the attack as an excuse to bomb Afghanistan. Porter and other Americans inadvertently assist these scams by suppressing investigations. Government officials cannot help the nation if the citizens ridicule them as conspiracy nuts. Hundreds of citizens have tried to help Americans realize that their nation has problems, but none of their books have done anything to improve the nation because most people refuse to consider that they might be correct. Millions of people will ignore what I say because I am alive, not because they find mistakes with my accusations. Most people will also follow the majority of people, and they believe almost everything they see on television. In fact, a slogan in some advertisements is, "as seen on TV." The first priority of the people who conduct scams is the control of the media. As long as they can manipulate the millions of sheep, it makes no difference what the rest of us are saying. Since 1945, lots of people have worried that the next World War will be horrible because it will involve nuclear weapons. I think we're having the next World War right now, but the primary weapon in this war is deception, mainly through television, but also newspapers and magazines. It's easier for journalists to deceive people than it is for a military to conquer them. An Associated Press article from May 13, 1996, provides an example. After Tim McVeigh's bomb exploded, one of the first policemen to run into the building was Sergeant Terrence Yeakey. He helped people out of the building, then fell through 2 floors, injuring his back. The city decided to give him a Medal of Honor at a ceremony about a year after the bombing. Unfortunately, he committed suicide 3 days before the ceremony. His suicide was described in one sentence. He had apparently tried to slit his wrists, then shot himself to death. It ain't easy to get away with the murder of a policeman, but one journalist can deceive millions of people into thinking the murder was suicide. How obvious do the scams have to be before the American people realize that they're being manipulated? For example, what if Paul Query had written this? He tried to slit his wrists, and then he tried to rape himself, and then he ran over himself with his car. Would that be obvious enough? If a military attacked us, many people would proudly fight back, but most people are easily controlled with deceptive news reports. By the way, why would they kill Sergeant Yeakey? According to Pat Shannon, Yeakey had evidence that the attack was a scam, and he was planning to expose it. But, as with Parton and McKinney, most Americans ignored him. It ain't difficult to understand that the McVeigh bomb and 9/11 were scams. So how can people get away with such obvious scams? Because America is corrupt beyond your wildest dreams. There are lots of Americans willing to join these scams. And Bush's buddy is also. The FBI violates so many laws that they should put themselves on their most wanted list. Americans often boast about our Bill of Rights and our freedom of speech, and they often ridicule the government-controlled media of communist nations. However, the American media is being used like a weapon to manipulate the public and keep them ignorant, often in obvious ways, such as when Congresswoman McKinney was described as more repugnant than Yasser Arafat's 3-week-old underwear. How is that worthless and insulting propaganda any better than the communist propaganda? The American people are being deceived, not educated or encouraged to discuss issues. Furthermore, neither the U.S. government nor the American people put pressure on the news reporters to stop this manipulation and provide intelligent articles. The only pressure news reporters feel is to provide news that is more entertaining than their competition. The reason is simply because most Americans want entertainment, not serious reports. This is why American news reports are dominated by sexual titillation, Hollywood gossip, and weird crimes. As long as most people behave like these guys, America will continue to suffer from extreme corruption and disgusting news reports. Only a small percentage of the population created America in 1776, and only a small number would be needed to change the nation today. The question I wonder about is, does America have enough respectable citizens to turn this nation into something we can be proud of?